It was supposed to be a simple drive home. Just another evening in a quiet town where nothing ever really happened. At least, that was what James Carter thought as he sat in the passenger seat of his father's sleek black SUV, staring out at the familiar streets. He had spent the weekend with his mom in the next city over, and was now heading back home with his dad, Charles Carter. The two had been chatting casually about school, basketball, and James's plans for the summer. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until the flashing red and blue lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Charles sighed, his grip tightening on the steering wheel as he slowed the car to a stop. "Stay calm, son," he said, his voice steady but firm. James nodded but felt his stomach twist into knots. He had seen enough stories on the news, had heard enough warnings from his parents, his teachers, even from some of his friends' parents. Keep your hands visible, don't make sudden moves, be respectful. It was a conversation that no teenager should have to hear, but James had heard it too many times. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his belt as he approached the driver's side window. His face was stern, his eyes cold and unreadable. Charles rolled down the window, keeping both hands on the wheel. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The cop, whose name tag read Warren, didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a long, deliberate look inside the car, his gaze landing on James. "License and registration," he said, his tone clipped. Charles handed over his license along with the registration from the glove compartment. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" he asked calmly. Officer Warren barely glanced at the documents before focusing on James again. "Step out of the car." James froze. His heart pounded against his ribs. He looked at his father, whose expression didn't change, but James could see the tension in his jaw. "Is there a reason you're asking my son to step out of the car?" Charles asked, keeping his tone even. Warren's eyes flickered with something unreadable, annoyance, maybe frustration. "Did I stutter? Out, now." James swallowed hard and slowly opened the door. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to get home. But the moment his sneakers touched the pavement, Warren grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. "Hey!" Charles protested, opening his door, but Warren shot him a glare. "Stay in the car, sir, unless you want to be next." James barely had time to react before Warren's grip tightened on his arm. "What's in your pockets?" the cop demanded. "Just my phone," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. Warren smirked, then suddenly shoved him backward. James stumbled, catching himself before he fell. "Watch yourself," Warren sneered. James felt his blood boil. "I didn't do anything." Before he could say another word, Warren's fist swung through the air and connected with James's face. The impact was sudden, knocking James off balance as pain shot through his jaw. A sharp gasp filled the air. Charles was out of the car in an instant, his face unreadable, his stance unshaken. He locked eyes with Warren, his voice dangerously low. "That was a mistake," Warren scoffed. "Oh yeah, and what are you going to do about it?" Charles reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black wallet, and flipped it open. The golden badge inside caught the glow of the streetlights. Chief Charles Carter, the new head of this department. The silence that followed was deafening. Warren's smirk vanished, his face draining of color. The bystanders who had started gathering held their breath. James wiped the blood from his lip, watching as Warren's hands trembled slightly. The power dynamic had just shifted, and Warren knew it, and now the real reckoning was about to begin. "Officer." Warren's face went pale, his mouth slightly open as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The streetlights overhead buzzed softly, the only sound breaking the tense silence. The small crowd that had started gathering on the sidewalk stood frozen, their eyes bouncing between Charles Carter and the officer who had just struck his son. James wiped his lip again, feeling the warm trickle of blood on his fingers. His jaw ached, but he refused to let the pain show. He had never seen his father like this before, calm, but with an energy that made the air feel heavier. It was the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced, only felt. "Chief," Warren finally muttered, barely above a whisper. His hands flexed at his sides, his body stiff. "That is right," Charles said, slowly tucking his badge back into his pocket. "And in case you need a reminder, that means I am your superior." The weight of those words settled between them. Warren blinked, his brain clearly working overtime to process what had just happened. He had punched the teenage son of his new boss. James could almost hear the wheels turning in Warren's head, scrambling for a way out. Some excuse that would make what he had done seem reasonable. But there was no excuse for this. "I didn't know." Warren started, but Charles cut him off. "You didn't know who I was," he finished for him. "But that shouldn't have mattered, should it?" His voice was steady, controlled, but laced with something sharp. "You didn't hesitate. You didn't ask questions. You saw my son and you saw a problem." Warren opened his mouth again, but Charles raised a hand. "No, do not speak. Not yet." James stepped back, watching his father with a mix of pride and apprehension. He had always known his dad was respected, a man of discipline and fairness. But he had never seen him like this, standing firm in the face of injustice with the full weight of his authority pressing down on the man in front of him. The bystanders started murmuring, shifting on their feet. Some had pulled out their phones, recording the moment as they whispered to each other. This was not just another traffic stop gone wrong. This was something bigger. Charles turned slightly, glancing around at the crowd before locking eyes with Warren again. "You were going to tell me why you stopped us," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Warren cleared his throat, his voice suddenly unsteady. I thought the vehicle looked suspicious." Charles raised an eyebrow. "A black SUV in a nice neighborhood, at a reasonable hour." He tilted his head slightly. "That is what looked suspicious to you?" Warren shifted uncomfortably. "I ran the plates and the system flagged." Charles cut him off again. "Do not lie to me." His voice had dropped, quiet, but heavy. "That car is registered under my name. There is nothing in any system that would have flagged it." James watched as Warren swallowed hard, his face tightening. "Let me guess," Charles continued, stepping forward just enough to close the space between them. "You saw my son, a young black teenager in the passenger seat, and that was enough." Warren exhaled sharply through his nose. "I was just doing my job." Charles studied him for a long moment before nodding. "I believe you," he said. For a second, Warren almost looked relieved until Charles added, "And that is the problem." James felt something in his chest tighten. His father's words carried a weight that sank deep. Charles turned slightly, speaking not just to Warren but to everyone watching. "How many times has this happened before?" His voice carried across the street, clear and strong. "How many times has someone else's son been stopped, accused, mistreated, without anyone to protect them? Without cameras? Without witnesses?" A few people in the crowd nodded, murmuring in agreement. Charles turned back to Warren. "If I was not here tonight, what would have happened next?" Warren hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. James shuddered slightly, imagining the possibilities. His father's presence had changed the course of this night, but what if things had been different? Charles took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, as if reining himself back in. "This is not over," he said, his voice cool. "Not by a long shot." He turned to James, his expression softening just enough to be noticeable. "Get in the car, son." James did not argue. He pulled the car door open and slid into the passenger seat, but he kept his eyes trained on the rearview mirror. He watched, as Warren stood stiff, his hands clenched at his sides, his face unreadable. His father walked around to the driver's side, moving with purpose. He did not look back at Warren. He did not need to. As Charles got into the car and shut the door, James finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" Charles did not answer right away. He started the engine, letting the low hum fill the space between them. Then finally he said, "Now we do what should have been done a long time ago." James glanced at his father, seeing the determination in his face. This was not just about tonight. This was about every night before it, as they Pulled away from the curb, James looked back one last time. Warren was still standing there, frozen in place, staring after them. But James knew the real story was just beginning. The drive home was silent at first, the weight of the moment pressing against the air inside the car. James kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind still replaying what had happened over and over again. The flashing lights, the demand to get out of the car, the punch. The way Officer Warren's face had changed the second he realized who his father was. It made James sick to think about it. If his father had been anyone else, if he had not been the new police chief, that night could have ended very differently. He glanced at his dad, who was gripping the steering wheel with steady hands, his expression unreadable. But James knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed slightly every time they stopped at a red light. His father was angry, not just about what happened to him, but about what it meant. James swallowed, then finally broke the silence. "Dad, has this happened to you before?" Charles exhaled through his nose, staring straight ahead. "Yes," he said simply. James felt something heavy settle in his stomach. He had always known his father had faced things like this in his career. Discrimination, bias, moments where he had to prove himself over and over again despite his rank and experience. But hearing him say it so plainly, as if it were just a fact of life, made James's hands tighten into fists in his lap. "Did you ever do anything about it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Charles let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "I worked twice as hard. I kept my head down. I told myself that if I climbed high enough, I could change things." James let that sink in. His father had spent his entire career proving himself, earning respect, getting to a position where he could make a difference. And still, that night had happened. "So what now?" James asked. "What happens to Warren?" His father sighed, his grip on the wheel tightening. "He is suspended until further notice. But that is just the beginning." James felt a flicker of something. Satisfaction, maybe. But it did not last long. He knew suspensions were temporary. He knew the system had ways of protecting its own. Would Warren really face consequences? Or would he be back on the streets in a few weeks, treating someone else the same way? As they pulled into their driveway, James could see the lights on in the house. His mother must have been waiting for them. He knew she was going to be furious. Before he could step out of the car, his father turned to him, his eyes steady. "James, listen to me." James looked at him, waiting. "This isn't over, but I need you to trust me on how we handle it," Charles said. "No reckless decisions. No taking this into your own hands." James clenched his jaw, nodding even though something inside him still burned. He had always believed in his father. But right now, patience felt impossible. They walked inside, and the moment his mother saw them, she rushed over, her eyes scanning James's face. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice sharp with worry. Charles sighed. "It's a long story," he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But it's going to be all over the news by morning." James felt his stomach twist at that. He had not even thought about the fact that people had been recording. By now that video was probably already spreading online. His mother turned to James, gently touching his face where the bruise was already forming. "Are you okay?" James nodded. "I'm fine, Mom." She exhaled, then turned to Charles, her expression hardening. "What are you going to do about this?" Charles met her gaze. "I'm going to handle it." James saw the way his mother's shoulders stiffened, the way her lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope that means more than just paperwork and meetings, Charles," she said, "because I am tired of seeing things like this happen." James saw something flash in his father's eyes, something rare. A deep frustration, a quiet exhaustion that he rarely let show. "I know," Charles said. "And trust me, this time it is different." James was not sure what that meant exactly, but he hoped it was true. The next morning, the world seemed to move faster. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from friends, classmates, and people he barely knew. When he opened social media, his stomach flipped. The video was everywhere. The footage showed everything. The way Warren had yanked him out of the car, The punch, the moment his father revealed who he was. The comments were a mix of outrage and disbelief. Some people demanded justice. Others tried to justify what had happened. James turned off his phone, feeling a headache coming on. When he walked into the kitchen, his father was already dressed for work, sipping his coffee, his face unreadable. His mother sat at the table, arms crossed, the news playing softly on the television. James hesitated before speaking. "What are they saying?" His mother gestured to the screen. "The mayor is calling for a full investigation. There's pressure from the community. People want Warren fired." James felt his chest tighten. "And what do you think is going to happen?" Charles set his coffee down. "That depends," he said. "The department is already feeling the heat. Warren is just the surface problem. The real issue is how many more officers think like him." James swallowed. He had never thought about it like that, but his father was right. Warren was not an isolated problem. He was just a symptom of something bigger. His father stood up, adjusting his badge. "I need to get to the station," But James. James looked up. "Whatever happens next, you need to be smart," Charles said. "Do not let anger control you. That is what people like Warren expect. They expect you to react in a way that makes their actions seem justified." James nodded, but something inside him still burned. He did not know how to just sit back and wait. As his father left, James sat at the table, staring at the news as reporters discussed the video, the department, and what might come next. One thing was clear. This was far from over, and James had a feeling the fight had only just begun. James could feel the energy in the air shifting. Everywhere he went, people were talking about what happened. At school, teachers gave him sympathetic looks, and some students whispered as he passed by. Others approached him directly, telling him how messed up it was, how they had seen the video and could not believe it. A few even talked about organizing a protest. He knew this was bigger than just him now. People wanted change. They wanted action. Later that afternoon, James sat in his room, scrolling through endless posts and news reports. The mayor had released a statement condemning the incident, calling for accountability and justice. But to James, it felt like empty words. Warren had been suspended, but that was not enough. There were no guarantees he would actually lose his job. His phone buzzed and he saw a message from his best friend, Marcus. "Marcus. Yo, you see this?" James clicked the link, and his stomach twisted as he saw a news clip playing. It showed Warren leaving the station, covering his face as reporters bombarded him with questions. Reporter: "Officer Warren, do you have any comment on your actions that night?" Warren said nothing, pushing past them. Reporter: "Do you think your suspension is fair? Should you be fired?" Still, no response. James clenched his jaw, feeling the anger creeping back in. Warren was running, hiding, refusing to face what he had done. Then another notification popped up, a new video. This time it was from a former officer who had worked with Warren. The man spoke carefully, his words measured, but the message was clear. "Warren was always like this," the ex-officer said. "This is not an isolated incident. It just happened to be caught on camera this time." James's hands tightened around his phone. His father had been right. Warren was not just one bad cop. He was part of something bigger. A knock at the door made James jump. His mother stepped in, her expression serious. "Your father is calling a press conference," she said. "He wants you there." James's heart pounded. "Why?" she hesitated. "Because this is more than just about Warren now. Your father is about to shake up the entire department." James grabbed his jacket and followed her out the door. When they arrived at the station, a crowd had already gathered. Reporters, community members, activists, people from all over the city stood waiting. Some held signs demanding justice. Others chanted. The tension in the air was thick, electric. James saw his father standing at the podium dressed in full uniform, his badge gleaming under the bright lights. His expression was unreadable, but James knew that look. His father was about to say something that would change everything. Charles took a deep breath and adjusted the microphone. The crowd fell silent. "I became police chief because I believed in protecting this city," he began. "But protecting this city means protecting all of its people. What happened to my son should never have happened. To him, or to anyone else." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Cameras flashed. I have spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, if I climbed high enough, I could change things from the inside. But change does not come from silence. It comes from action. James felt his chest tighten. He had never heard his father speak like this before. Charles's voice was steady, clear, effective immediately. "An independent review of this department will begin, and I am pushing for Warren's termination. But this is not just about one officer. It is about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. That ends now." The crowd erupted into cheers. Reporters shouted questions. James felt something shift in the air. Hope, maybe. But even as the crowd reacted, James noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A few officers standing near the entrance, watching with crossed arms, their expressions cold. Not everyone was happy about this, and James had a feeling that his father had just made some powerful enemies. As his father stepped away from the podium, he met James's eyes and gave him a small nod. James nodded back. He knew this fight was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As James stood beside his father, watching the crowd erupt with emotions, he felt a strange mix of hope and unease. His father had made a bold move, one that the community needed, but not everyone wanted change. And as James scanned the faces in the crowd, he saw it. A group of officers standing near the station entrance, their arms crossed, their gazes cold. They did not clap, they did not cheer. They only watched. James knew that look. It was not just disagreement, it was resistance. His father turned to him. "Let's go inside," Charles said, his voice low. "We need to talk." James followed him through the doors, stepping past the officers who barely moved aside. The tension inside the station was thick, almost suffocating. Some officers gave his father a respectful nod, but others barely acknowledged him. James could feel it. His father had drawn a line, and now everyone had to choose a side. As they entered Charles's office, James shut the door behind them, and his father exhaled and ran a hand over his face. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," he admitted. "I just put a target on my back." James knew he was right. The department had operated a certain way for years, and now his father was forcing a reckoning. Before James could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. One of his father's closest officers, Lieutenant Harris, stepped inside. His face was tense, his body rigid. "You need to see this," Harris said, handing over a tablet. Charles took it and pressed play. A grainy security feed flickered on the screen, showing the parking lot behind the station. The footage was dark, but James could make out the figures. 4 men standing in a tight circle, talking. He recognized one of them immediately. Warren. James's pulse spiked as he leaned in. "What is he doing here?" Harris's expression darkened. "That's not the real question. The real question is, who is he talking to?" James looked closer. The other men were officers, not just any officers, but high-ranking ones, men who had been in the department for years. Charles's jaw tightened. "They are protecting him," Harris nodded. "And they are not happy about your announcement. Warren may be suspended, but he is still here. And he is not alone." James's stomach twisted. His father was trying to clean up a system that did not want to be cleaned. And now, the people who stood to lose the most were making their moves in the shadows. Charles shut off the tablet and placed it on the desk. His face was unreadable, but James could see the wheels turning in his mind. His father was preparing for the next battle. Then Charles looked at Harris. "We need to know what they are planning. Find out everything you can." Harris gave a sharp nod and left the office. James sat down, his mind racing. "Dad, do you think they are going to come after you?" His father hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "They will push back," he admitted. "But we are not backing down." James could hear the resolve in his father's voice. But he also knew something else. His father was in danger. and so was he. As the night stretched on, James could not shake the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. Then, one caught his eye. It was from an unknown number. The message was short. A warning. Stay out of this, kid. You do not know who you are dealing with. James's fingers tightened around the phone. Someone was watching, and they wanted him to stay quiet. But James had never been the kind of person to walk away. He had a feeling things were about to get a lot worse. James stared at the message on his phone, his heart pounding. Someone wanted him to back off, but that only made him more determined. He knew now that this was not just about Warren. It was bigger. There were people in the department who wanted to keep things the way they were, and they were willing to go to great lengths to silence anyone who stood in their way. His father had made a stand, but James could see the toll it was taking. Charles barely slept, constantly looking over his shoulder, checking every decision twice. The press conference had drawn national attention, and the mayor was now under pressure to take immediate action. Investigations had begun, but there was resistance from within the department. Some officers had already resigned, others were outright refusing to cooperate. And then there were the ones like Warren, still lurking in the shadows, still waiting. James could not sit back and watch. He needed to do something. Late that night, he met with Marcus behind the school gym. Marcus had been following everything closely and had connections that James did not. Together, they had been digging into old records, looking for patterns, complaints against officers that had been buried, cases dismissed without investigation. What they found was worse than James had imagined. There were years of reports against Warren, all swept under the rug. And it was not just him. Other officers, some of the same men James had seen in the security footage, had their names buried in similar cases. This was systematic. James took a deep breath. "We need to leak this," he said. "If we send it to the press, they will have to act." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, but that makes you a target. More than you already are." James knew he was right, but this was not about staying safe. It was about doing the right thing. The next morning, the files were sent to every major news outlet. Within hours, the city was on fire. Headlines exploded across the internet. Corrupt officers protected for years. New reports reveal pattern of abuse. The mayor held an emergency meeting, and an independent task force was called in. The city was demanding arrests. Then came the breaking news. Officer Warren had disappeared. James felt a chill run down his spine when he heard the report. No one had seen him since last night. Some claimed he was on the run, but others believed something else. He was being protected. That night, James and his family stayed at a hotel under police watch. His father had not said it outright, but James knew the truth. They were not safe. Then, around midnight, there was a knock on the door. James froze. His father moved quickly, motioning for them to stay back. He checked the peephole, then slowly opened the door. It was Harris. His face was tense. "We found him," he said. Charles stepped outside, closing the door behind him. James pressed his ear against the wall, listening. He could not hear everything, but he caught pieces. Abandoned warehouse. Was not alone. Something is off. His father re-entered the room a moment later, his expression unreadable. James knew that look. "What happened?" Charles hesitated before answering. "They found Warren tied up, beaten badly. Someone got to him before we did." James felt his breath catch. "Who?" His father shook his head. "We do not know yet. But whoever it was, they did not want him talking." James sat back, his mind racing. Someone had silenced Warren, but why? The investigation was already happening. The truth was already out. Then it hit him. Warren was not the mastermind. He was just a piece. And the people who had protected him for years were now cleaning up loose ends. His father seemed to realize the same thing. He picked up his phone and made a call. "We need to move faster," he said. "We are running out of time." James watched as his father stepped to the window, looking out over the city. For the first time, James saw something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before. Not just determination, not just anger, fear, because they had won the battle. But the real war had just begun. The next few days passed in a blur of news reports, investigations, and internal chaos within the department. More officers were being questioned, and some had already been placed on administrative leave. The corruption ran deep, deeper than even James had imagined. But despite the victories, there was still an uneasy feeling hanging in the air. Warren had been found, but whoever had beaten him into silence was still out there. His father had made enemies, and so had James. It was no longer just about one bad cop. This was about an entire system that had been built to protect itself at all. And now that system was crumbling. James sat in his father's office at the station, watching as Charles flipped through reports. His father looked exhausted, but he had not backed down. He had not wavered. The mayor had promised full cooperation with the investigation, and federal oversight was being discussed. Change was coming, even if it was slow. James let out a small, "Do you think we did enough?" Charles looked up, his expression serious. "We did what we could, but this fight is not over." James knew that. He also knew that his father had placed himself in the crosshairs of people who were used to controlling things from behind the scenes. They would not give up easily. A soft knock on the door made them both turn. Harris stepped in, his face unreadable. Warren regained consciousness. James sat up straight, and his father immediately grabbed his jacket. They followed Harris down the hallway and into one of the interrogation rooms, where Warren sat slumped in a chair. His face was bruised, his lips split and his wrists cuffed to the table. He barely looked up when they entered. Charles took a seat across from him, his voice calm but firm. "Who did this to you?" Warren let out a slow breath, wincing at the pain. "You already know," he muttered. James narrowed his eyes. "We do not know anything unless you tell us." Warren chuckled bitterly. "Come on, Chief, you think I was the mastermind? You think I had the power to bury cases for years? I was just the muscle. A tool they used to keep things in order." Charles leaned forward. "Who are they?" Warren hesitated, then shook his head. "It does not matter. They are already covering their tracks. The people you are looking for, you will never find them." James clenched his fists. "So that is it? You are just going to protect them?" Warren looked at him, something unreadable in his expression. "I am not protecting them, but I am not stupid enough to cross them either. If they got to me, they will get to you too." Charles studied him for a long moment before standing. "You are already going away for a long time. If you decide you want to help yourself, you know where to find me." As they left the room, James felt a knot tighten in his chest. There were still unanswered questions, still pieces of the puzzle that did not fit. But for now, this part was over. Warren was out of the picture, and the department was finally being forced to clean house. Later that night, James and his father sat on the front porch of their home. The city was quiet, but James could still feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. He turned to his father. "Do you think they will come after us?" Charles exhaled slowly. "Maybe, but we will be ready." James nodded, knowing his father meant it. They had started something that could not be undone. The people who thrived in the shadows were now being dragged into the light. And even if they fought back, the truth was already out there. For the first time in days, James allowed himself to breathe. The battle was far from over, but they had won an important fight. And no matter what came next, they were not backing down. As the night stretched on, James sat back, watching the city he had grown up in. It was broken, but maybe, just maybe, it could be fixed.